This meeting is being recorded.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History Lunch and Learn, Indigenous on Freedom and Race Making in Early New England. Our presenter today, Dr. Joanne Jahnke-Wegner, will examine how English enslavement of Indigenous peoples during the Pequot and King Philip's Wars contributed to the racialization of Indigenous peoples in early New England. Dr. Jahnke-Wegner, a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, where she teaches classes on early America, women and gender, and race and medicine. She received her PhD from the University of Minnesota and is currently at work on 3 articles and a book manuscript on captivity, enslavement, and race making in New England. So we're really excited to see what you found today. So welcome, Dr. Jahnke-Wegner. I'll let you get started.
All right, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me all right. I have a bit of a cold that I'm recovering from, so hopefully my voice behaves. I want to start by thanking all of you for coming to my talk today. I'm thrilled to be here. And I want to thank the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History for their generous support of my research. What I'm sharing today is one small part of my larger project about the consequences of English enslavement for Indigenous people in New England from 1630 to 1763. Today, I will discuss the relationship between English enslavement of Indigenous people and race making in the early modern Atlantic. So I'll start with some context and then I'll get into the meat of my argument. At the end, I have some just final thoughts about research at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, and then I will take questions. So in August and September of 1676, John Hull, who was treasurer of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, conducted 2 public auctions where he orchestrated the sale of 200 Narragansett, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc men, women, and children into servitude in the colony or into the English Caribbean. Between 2 auctions of June of 1675 and September of 1676, officials in Plymouth Colony did something similar. All 4 of these slave auctions took place during King Philip's War, a brutal Anglo-Native war that roiled New England from 1675 to 78. All told, English colonists killed 3,000 Indigenous people and enslaved or indentured about 2,000 more, 1,500 in the colonies and 500 of whom were sold into Atlantic slavery. So historians have established very clearly that Europeans enslaved Native Americans, and this was a widespread practice by the 17th century. From the time that Columbus arrived, Spanish colonizers enslaved or reduced Indigenous peoples to servitude and slavery in agricultural and extractive industries. The French took a different approach, constructing their Indigenous slave trade upon a scaffolding of gift-giving and reciprocity with Native Americans as a way to establish and maintain trade and diplomatic alliances. English colonists in Virginia enslaved Native Americans as an outgrowth of war or labor, and in the case of the Carolinas, as part of an open commodity trade. In New England, Puritans were up to similar things, including exploiting the labor of captive Native Americans or selling them for personal or corporate profit. This had the added effect, of course, of clearing Native Americans from land desired by English colonists for settlement, as noted in Wendy Warren's evocative use of the phrase unplanting. Colonizing powers from different times and places thus shared a logic where they enslaved Native Americans to exploit labor, to maintain economic and diplomatic relationships, to capitalize resource extraction and colonization, and to dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands. So the purpose of my presentation today is to build on this truly excellent scholarship on Native American enslavement by offering preliminary sketches on how the English process of enslaving Indigenous peoples in New England during the Pequot, but especially King Philip's War, contributed to the racialization of Indigenous peoples in 17th century North America. So historians have situated the emergence of racialized thinking about Indigenous people mainly in the 18th century, where pre-existing stereotypes of Native Americans that emerged from early colonization were used by scientists like Carolus Linnaeus to create a racist human taxonomy that linked outsider status to Native Americans based on the color of their skin. Among English colonizers themselves, observations about bodily difference were mediated through what Joyce Chaplin calls natural philosophy. English colonists tried to explain Native American biological weakness due to disease, right, as a fact that made them unfit to occupy their own lands that English looked to for colonization. Nancy Shoemaker argued, however, that Indigenous people like the Cherokee also claimed the moniker of red, based on their own color symbolism, to develop categories that could account for biological cultural differences. For my part, so I'm going to take a little different tack. So for my part, I argue that English colonists in New England used a combination of physical and intellectual practices to facilitate and justify enslaving and dispossessing Indigenous peoples, a process which I argue contributed to the social construction of race. Colonizers combined military violence with legal, biblical, and cultural discourses, as well as the logic of the market, to create a system of enslavement where new habits of mind about Indigenous peoples enabled English colonists to transform Native American trading partners, political allies, students, and Christian converts into servants, slaves, commodities, and racialized others. So what I don't like to think about this, but how I think about this is as process. And so that is what I want to talk through today and see if I can get my slide to advance. Maybe, maybe not. There we go. So I'm going to talk about process, and I'm going to talk about King Philip's War. So during King Philip's War, governing officials in Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island instigated Native enslavement through the creation first of wartime directives that used the promise of human plunder or scalps to incentivize military service. So I'll explain how this worked. In October of 1675, for example, the War Council of Connecticut provided a commission for 6 English men and their native allies to scout for enemy Indians. And the purpose was to go out into the field to try to figure out where the Pequots were and to root them out, to remove them from their land. If they did this, and in the process of doing this, they would be rewarded. And I'll quote here so you can get a sense of the language. They said, "And for every man's head or live man they bring, we will pay them 4 coats of trading cloth, a head or man forthwith." In February 1675, Massachusetts Bay did something similar. They offered scouting parties a reward of 3 pounds per head, or the prisoners so taken. Wartime orders such as these promised material reward and enticing economic incentive for English colonists to become soldiers and prosecute a war against the Pequot. But such edicts or commissions provided an early legal and intellectual foundation for Indigenous enslavement. What these orders and commissions did was create a mental shift among colonists and soldiers about how Indigenous people could be treated during war. Instead of distinguishing between Indigenous combatants and non-combatants, English colonists created an ideological shift that designated all Indigenous people as fair target or captivity or death, regardless of age or gender. I argue that these wartime edicts created what were in effect scalp and captive bounties that applied the logic of wild animals to enemy Native Americans. So from the earliest days of colonization, colonial governments had used, had used hunting bounties to encourage colonists to kill wolves or other animal predators that threatened English livestock. During the war, however, colonial governments applied this logic to human beings to facilitate the murder, capture, and removal of enemy Indigenous people. Through such orders, English leaders equated Native Americans with wild animals, creating a rough equivalency where both wild animals and wild people could be targeted for slaughter and removal. English bounties thus enabled the English to undermine earlier observations about their shared humanity with Indigenous people by marketizing Native American death and captivity, while making it possible for English colonists to see Indigenous people as plunder and commodities. When the English did this, they were planting what historian Karen Kupperman calls the seeds of racism. And I will quote her here to talk about how this worked. She said, as long as the English believed that the Indians were their younger brothers, that the Americans were different in no fundamental way, they could not be viewed as inherently inferior to Europeans. Once the difference between the two groups came to be seen as meaningful, it would be a short step to seeing the different life of Indians as less valuable than the European way of life, and to attributing their different patterns of development to qualities inherent in each group. So Kupperman is describing a process of racial differentiation, which I would argue the scalp and captive bounties contribute to. While Indigenous enemies in the 17th century were not yet red, English colonists were doing the work of othering by reducing enemy Native Americans to impediments to be removed, like wild animals, expediting Native American exclusion from colonial society while lumping more and more Indigenous people under the umbrella category of savage. During the next step of enslavement, English soldiers captured and forcibly removed Narragansetts, Nipmucs, Wampanoags, and their allies from their lands and relocated them to colonial centers where English incarcerated Indigenous people and prepared them for sale. So I'm talking about process again. English military commanders led organized expeditions that resulted in the capture and submission of hundreds of Indigenous captives to colonial governments in Connecticut, in Massachusetts Bay, in Plymouth, and Rhode Island. Captive taking was a brutal process. In a July 1675 letter to Waite Winthrop, Roger Williams described how English men hunted for Native Americans, and this is the language they use. Williams described English soldiers driving in the woods in hopes of kicking them up, like English men did while they hunted for deer. Other soldiers described similar hunts, including James Oliver, who ended one letter with a description of an English assault on a Narragansett stronghold. And then he goes on to describe the devastation. He says, whereby the best intelligence we killed 300 fighting men. As prisoners, we took 50 men and above 300 women and children. We burnt above 5 houses, left but 9, and burnt all their corn that was in baskets, great store. This is catastrophic loss for the Narragansett. Letters from other soldiers related similar scenarios regarding how the English and their Native American allies worked through the countryside. Very regimented manner, engaging in battles, skirmishes, and surprise attacks on enemy Indigenous people who were killed outright or captured and forwarded to colonial centers for dispersal. And here you can see the trajectory of the removal of 2 captives in particular, Wotuna-Kanusk and her son. She was the wife of King Philip, for whom the war was named, and this was their child. So the next step English colonists performed after capture was to forcibly remove Indigenous peoples from their homelands, using a variety of methods. They marched Indigenous people overland in coffles. They sent captives in the company of the military commissary. They moved Indigenous people via coastal shipping. In July of 1676, Benjamin Church and his forces captured Wet'suwet'en and her son, and they forced them overland to Plymouth. En route, which took many days of march, Captain Church drove his prisoners into the Bridgewater Pound and set his Indian soldiers to guard them. In this moment, Church is using the town animal pound as a little literal holding pen for captive Wampanoags, an improvised space of incarceration where captives could be briefly secured before further removal to Plymouth. While English and native soldiers may have seen this detention in town animal pounds as a practical tactic in the moment, I would argue it was highly symbolic. These pens normally enclosed stray domestic animals who had become public nuisances when loose and wandering about. English colonists built animal pounds, as you can see here, by stacking field stones to a height of about 4 to 6 feet. They had one wooden gate at the opening that was locked to contain wayward animals until the owner could come make restitution for the damage the animals had done to English neighbors and drive the four-legged offenders home. Depending on the frequency of animal incarceration, pounds could have been grassy and grown in like you see here, or they could have been bare dirt with fresh or composting animal manure. The quite possibly disgusting nature of these enclosures, combined with exposure to the elements, made the Wampanoag's occupation of this space a dehumanizing experience. Wampanoag captives tried to escape these open-air enclosures, but Church stymied that possibility by having Indigenous allies guard his Wampanoag prisoners. When English soldiers put captive Wampanoags into animal pounds, they equated captive Wampanoags with errant domestic animals and treated them as lower-order bodies who were not deserving of the freedom of movement that English colonists enjoyed. This created yet another equivalency between Native Americans and animals, in this case, domestic. English colonists cast themselves as superior to their Indigenous neighbors through the creation of a hierarchy among English and Native American bodies, where the English could move freely through the countryside, while Indigenous peoples could be incarcerated in manure-ridden pens. English colonists did not just incarcerate Native American enemies, however. They also incarcerated Christianized Native Americans. Despite the fact that some Indigenous people had converted to Christianity, adopted English cultural practices, and remained loyal to the English, they were not safe from English depredations. On November 3rd, 1675, Massachusetts Bay ordered the relocation of Christianized Native Americans from Natick to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. On November 3rd, the English refined this order, making it illegal for Christianized Native Americans to leave. This forced relocation marked a profound downturn in living conditions for Christianized Native Americans. They were removed from their homes and communities and sent to windswept islands in the frigid harbor that provided little in the way of resources or protection from the elements. Even worse, it exposed Christianized Native Americans to slave raiding by English colonists who looked to the captive population on the island as a source of labor or plunder. The incarceration of Native Americans, however, also speaks to how racialization proceeded. Despite the fact that Christianized Native Americans emulated English lifeways and remained loyal to the English at great personal peril during the war, the English increasingly painted Indigenous peoples, friend or foe, with the same brush, merging older stereotypes of Native American savagery with new stereotypes of Christian Indian treachery. This placed all Indigenous peoples in what Walter Johnson calls a carceral landscape, where technologies of violence and surveillance limited freedom for all Native Americans. Through the processes I've discussed so far, English colonists reclassified captive Indigenous peoples as lower order bodies, undeserving of the protections of freeborn Englishmen. Instead, colonists treated captive Native Americans as wild people or errant domestic animals, less than human others, whose bodies they assigned new meanings through wartime military orders that monetized captive Indigenous peoples and reconfigured them as fit for enslavement. Military violence also allowed colonists to physically treat their Native American victims with impunity, while simultaneously creating habits of mind that underscored the ability of colonists to constitute captive Native Americans as people without kin, without community, without humanity. The physical, military work of enslavement put Native Americans into a state of exception as increasingly racialized others, beyond the boundaries of colonial personhood, subjecthood, and belonging in the English body politic. So this is the physical work of racialization. Now I will talk about the intellectual work of racialization. Colonial governments, Puritan ministers, and wartime chroniclers supplemented this material work of enslavement with legal, theological, and cultural discourses that were used then to construct and justify their system of Indigenous enslavement. So I'll start with the law first. English colonists looked to the 1641 Body of Liberties from Massachusetts Bay, which outlined the circumstances under which slavery would be allowed. And I have it here for you to read along with me. There shall never be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons doth morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged by authority. Now, it sounds pretty fair on the surface. Despite seeming to protect colonial subjects from bond slavery, the Body of Liberties created a substantial loophole for the perpetuation of slavery by extending it to captives taken in just wars. Since the English crafted this document shortly after the Pequot War, I have no doubt that colonists associated just wars with those conducted against Indigenous people. I have no doubt that captives taken and lawful to detain, they associated with Native Americans. To my thinking, this document laid the legal foundation for the enslavement of Native Americans. It served as a de facto slave code that sanctioned the unequal treatment of English colonists and Native Americans before the law. English colonists further entrenched legal differentiation between themselves and Native Americans between 1648 and 1672. In those years, every New England colony created or revised their legal codes to extend English authority over Native Americans. According to Margaret Newell, Massachusetts Bay revised its Body of Liberties in 1648, while Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island continued to pass legislation between 1645 and 1651. Newell calls this section of laws an Indian code, a forerunner of the Black codes, in that they constituted a body of law aimed at a specific ethnic group in their midst. Collectively speaking, these codes restricted Native American mobility, extended English legal jurisdiction over Indigenous people, ignoring their own systems of justice, and sanctioned English-style punishments against Native Americans deemed criminal or civil offenders. This included corporal punishment and sale into slavery. By the time we get to King Philip's War, we will see the law continue to be used. Between 1675 and 78, so directly during King Philip's War itself, English colonists in Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island continued to build on existing legal codes. They created Another series of wartime, we could call them edicts or orders or commissions, 20 in total between the colonies, that formed a legal apparatus for Indigenous enslavement. These laws did a number of things. They outlined whether captives should be indentured or enslaved, how they should be divided and dispersed, who should profit from the sale of Indigenous people, and what types of systems should be put in place to maintain enslavement of Native Americans beyond the war. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. I have many. In September of 1676, Massachusetts Bay selected a handful of men who had the power to write law about how to process and dispose of Indigenous people who surrendered. Bay leaders formed a second council to deal with other captives. The War Council of Connecticut made a similar appointment in August of 1676. They ordered several men to make rules about how Indigenous people would be divided. Faced with thousands of captives, colonial governments thus created ad hoc but effective legal apparatuses that carried the force of law and empowered powerful English men to enslave or sell captives on an as-needed basis. These laws allowed English colonists to distribute captives across multiple English households, putting more captive Indians under English control, while allowing English enslavers to exploit and profit directly from Native American labor. Such judicial proceedings, orders, edicts, and law then were important steps in the process of enslaving Indigenous people, because this Indigenous slave code created a legal double standard that categorically denied Native Americans rights and protections under English law, while systematizing their enslavement and reduction to chattel through the creation of racial distinctions. Puritan interpretations of the Bible also contributed to the discourse that justified Native American enslavement. The most thoroughly documented theological debate swirled around Philip's 9-year-old son, whom the English captured with his mother, Wotona in August 1676. Discussion began in September, when the Massachusetts Bay General Court referred the matter to Puritan ministers for consideration. In September, Samuel Arnold and John Cotton tried to decide whether Philip's son be a child of death. They observed that the rule in Deuteronomy 24:16, which you see here, meant that the child should not be punished for the actions of his father Philip. But in their writings, they also acknowledged that English bloodlust demanded the execution of the boy. And they kind of stopped. No definitive action seems to have been taken. In October, Increase Mather wades into the debate. He argued that the child should be put to death, because then he couldn't serve as a further future rallying point for Wampanoag resistance. On October 30th, James Keith sent a messenger to Massachusetts Bay, wondering what the court had decided about the mother and son. And he suggested further biblical verses to help the court make its decision. Wotona and her son, though, languish in jail throughout the winter of 1676-77. We only briefly get a glimpse into possibly what happened in March of 1677, when John Cotton made a terse observation in his journal that King Philip's 9-year-old son was to be sold into slavery. We don't know much more than that. While Puritan leaders grappled with the repercussions of their actions, especially regarding captive children, their debates provided an important biblical justification for enslavement when making legal decisions about captives. English chroniclers, writing during King Philip's War about what was happening, used and perpetuated tropes of Native American savagery to stoke anti-Indigenous sentiment into rabid Indian hating. And here's where we really see the work of race making happen. During the war, any goodwill built up through, through years of trade and peaceable relations among English and Native American individuals was washed away in an ocean of blood. English colonists attributed the actions of their indigenous enemies not to self-defense or protection of their kin and communities, but to Native American barbarity and savagery. English writers used inflammatory rhetoric and incendiary accounts to frame the telling of the war, creating a discourse that reinforced the worst English racial stereotypes about Native Americans. In describing the captures of colonists from Lancaster, for example, the anonymous author of News from New England used the following language. The minister himself, with his sister's husbands, returning from Boston a little after their engagement, and to their infinite grief, found their houses burnt to the ground and their wives and children taken captive. Or was this cruelty committed as the extent or nepalus ultra of their vengeance, but rather as an earnest of their barbarity? English colonists labeled Native American soldiers barbarians because the English refused to acknowledge them as enemy combatants. Legitimate reasons like self-defense for making war against the English. Subsequent writers repeated tropes of Native American savagery, including stories of torture, scalping, and the dashing of English babies' heads against rocks to fan English fears and animosity. Oops, I don't want that one yet. English writers also perpetuated a discourse of Native American savagery by claiming that indigenous men raped English women, which they did not. Two wartime chronicles make this claim. In 1675, the present state of New England claimed that an English woman from Swansea was taken, defiled, and scalped. A new and further narrative from 1676 ratcheted up the rhetoric and the race baiting. The heathen rarely giving quarter to those they take, but if they were women, they force them to satisfy their filthy lusts and then murder them, either cutting off the head, ripping open the belly, or scalping the head of skin and hair and hanging them up as trophies. There was no substantiated proof that Native men sexually assaulted English women, but the use of such language, the creation of this discourse, escalated anti-Indigenous rhetoric. While these types of publications served as a vent for Puritan and fear and bloodlust and hate, they also entrenched a discourse of Native American savagery that overwhelmed the existing social and economic relationships among colonists and their native neighbors. During the English War, the colonists used the term savagery as an adjective to belittle and denigrate the behavior of Narragansetts, Nipmucs, and Wampanoags, defending their communities, land, and sovereignty. Well, this was not necessarily new, as colonizers had long used the term savage to contrast indigenous behavior with that of civilized Europeans. I would argue that during King Philip's War, savagery took on additional layers of meaning. Instead of constructing Native Americans as red, colonial authors used the appellation savage as a category of racial difference that they increasingly applied to all Native Americans. They lumped them together as savages in an iteration of race making that was messier and far less linear than what they were doing with enslaved Africans, whom colonists never considered for inclusion in the English body politic. Well, the legal, theological, and cultural discourses constructed the narrative framework that expedited and justified Native American enslavement, deracination, and diaspora. Colonial governments turned Native Americans into servants and slaves through the market by using business practices to commodify captives. So I'm going to talk with you now about what the process of the market, or how the market worked, and then show you a couple of documents that demonstrate what I'm talking about. So just to talk about a couple auctions, Plymouth Colony held public auctions to dispose of captive Native Americans between June of 1675 and September of 1676. During those auctions, officials authorized the sale of 188 Indigenous people out of the colony and into Atlantic slavery. Most of them were sent to the Caribbean. Plymouth earned 397 pounds, 13 shillings, went into their colonial coffers. Massachusetts Bay did similar things in August and September of 1676. On August 24th, the English held a slave auction where 13 private individuals purchased 80 captive men, women, and children for 162 pounds. One of the most famous of the purchasers was Samuel Shrimpton. In one round, he purchased 16 Native Americans, 2 men, 9 women, 3 girls, and 2 infants for 41 pounds, 12 shillings. This is after he had previously purchased Indigenous people. In July 1676, he said that he purchased 9 the other day to send to Jamaica, that Caribbean connection. But then he thought he would keep 3 on his island. On that August day, other colonists purchased individual captives like Isaac Waldron, who paid 3 pounds for a boy, and Ephraim Savage, who paid 4 pounds, 10 shillings for a girl. During the 1676 auction, Thomas Smith, who was captain of the Seaflower and openly trading in Indigenous slaves, purchased 41 Indigenous people for 82 pounds, and them he sold out of the colony. Most people that August day, or that September day, excuse me, purchased anywhere from 1 to 13 captive Indigenous people. Between the 2 public auctions, John Hull, the treasurer of the colony, sold 190 Native Americans for over 330 pounds. And we have the record of one of those public auctions on this slide. So I've provided 2 things for you here. On the left is the entire page from John Hull's ledger with the number you can see who is purchasing whom. Isaac Waldron for a boy, Ephraim Savage for a girl. Those are people I talked about. You can see Shrimpton. And then on the left, I provided just a close-up so you can read the colonial handwriting, hopefully a little more clearly. It's hard to do, but you can see how Indigenous people were referred to, right? There aren't names of Indigenous people, with the exception of 2. Thomas Smith purchased the sons of Pomham and Matunis. Those were 2 of the most important sachems. So they had their children and they sold them out of the colony into slavery. But you get a sense of what's happening in the auction. We have the names of the purchasers, of the colonial men who bought Indigenous captives. We do not have the names of Indigenous people. And I want to talk about what is going on here in terms of race making. So the accounting records for the 2 auctions in Massachusetts Bay reveal the intersection of the material and the discursive, of how the physical violence of conquest and the intellectual justifications could combine with financial instruments and the function of the market to turn captive Native Americans into racialized commodities. So here's probably what happened this day. I'm speculating. Sometimes we do as historians. But it probably went something like this. Hull probably had the men who worked under him bring captive Native Americans from the spaces where they were incarcerated, and they congregated them in a central location. Next, Hull assigned captive Indigenous people descriptors based only on age and gender, as you can see here, right? Women, girls, infants, papooses, different descriptors, but no names. So they're described based on age and gender, not names, which is an overt act of dehumanization. Hull and his helpers then divided captives into groups of assorted sizes, ranging from singles, right, these little parcels of a single, all the way up to lots of 20 plus people. Prospective buyers probably inspected and then bid on the individuals and groups they were interested in purchasing. During this process, Hull turned Indigenous individuals into abstractions of their human selves, lumping them into multi-age and gender groups with only generic descriptors of boys, girls, men, women, and children. This deliberate categorization, right, this function of the market, is also a discursive act that allowed Hull to represent his indigenous captives, not as Narragansett, Nipmuc, or Wampanoag, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, elders and infants, but as nameless commodities whose values were determined by the price they could bring in the market. In foregoing their names and individual identities, Hull reduced human beings to line item entries in a ledger, eliding the humanity of captive Native Americans through abstraction and objectification in order to sell them into slavery for whatever price the market or the consumer would bear. The purchase price was then paid in pounds and shillings, the final realization of this trajectory of material and discursive violence that converged during the auction to render captive Native American peoples into fungible commodities sold for a market price. English householders then would take their captives off with them. They transported them on horseback or in wagons, or the captives probably likely transported themselves by foot to their new homes, while those purchased in larger lots and destined for transatlantic slavery were loaded for transnational shipping in a different version of a middle passage. So I'm going to go to the next slide and show you another set of pages from the ledger. So this is a page directly following the September auction. On this page, what you see are payments going out. These are payments going out to individual soldiers who were being paid for their military services rendered. So basically on these pages, we see money from the sale of captive Indians being put into the treasury and then quickly going out to offset the price of paying for the war. You will notice here that the names of the English soldiers are listed. Thomas Smith, Isaac Waldron, Samuel, I think that's Ashbelin, John, somebody, bad handwriting, William Gilbert. These guys have their names. So the act of commodification that facilitated sale contributed to racialization. This is starkly revealed in the pages of Hull's ledger immediately following his accounting entries for the public slave auctions. On those pages, profit from the auctions were immediately plowed back into the war effort as John Hull recorded the payments Massachusetts Bay made for dozens of soldiers for their military service. And these line item entries are really different. The first and last names of every soldier appear, as well as the amount in pounds and shillings that Hull paid each man for his military service. It was really striking for me when I sat in the archive and saw these pages. Striking to see the contrast, the way that the military labor of soldiers was acknowledged and paid in their own names, while the names of Narragansett, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag captives went unrecorded, as the English held them in animal pounds, reduced them to numbers, and auctioned them like human chattel. No white soldier is nameless in Hull's accounting. This throws the captive Native American as racialized commodity into stark relief when compared to individual colonists like Anthony Howard and Joseph Sherman, white men whose names remain in the historical record, while the names of thousands of Native Americans sold into servitude do not. In John Hull's careful handwriting, the discursive work which made human commodification possible was realized through the function of the market in unfree labor that translated into tangible wealth for individual English soldiers, English enslavers, and in this case, Massachusetts Bay as a corporate entity. The material practices of enslavement, the capture, the forced migration, the incarceration, the auction, intersected with English cultural, legal, theological, and economic discourses. All of these in turn converged at the site of a captive body to facilitate sale, enslavement, and racialization. English enslavement of captive Native Americans thus became another tool in the arsenal of racial formation. And this is a pretty gruesome calculus, where physical, material, and mental work transformed Narragansett, Nipmuc, Wampanoag people, at least in the English imagination, into animals, numbers, and commodities. This was done in the service of settler colonialism. Widespread enslavement and sale provided the human and financial capital to reproduce white settler society while simultaneously constructing race. When the English put bounties on Native American peoples and confined them in animal pounds, when they divided them into lots for sale, when they sold captives in generic categories, they were reconstituting Indigenous people as racialized others who could be treated with impunity, while those with white skin enjoyed the spoils of war in their given names. English military, political, and spiritual leaders intertwined projects of commodification, enslavement, dispossession, and racialization in order to recreate New England as a colonial regime where inclusion was increasingly based on race. So I'll end with a brief reflection on my time so far at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, which has been really fruitful for me, for understanding the persistence of English and later American marginalization of Indigenous peoples in the region. So most of my work so far has been in Massachusetts Bay and Maine and Rhode Island. So Connecticut is sort of the last place that I'm really digging in. I've done part of my fellowship here. I have more to complete. It has been really, really fruitful for me in understanding what was going on in both Southern and Northern New England during this period. So through the work of Jeannie O'Brien, I understand how Indigenous people persisted in New England after King Philip's War. Some were able to hold on to traditional lands through reservations. Others lived on the margins of colonial or American society in New England towns. Despite tropes of the vanishing Indian, New England town histories reveal how Indigenous peoples remained present and important contributors into the 19th century and, of course, today. Margaret Newell observes that before the American Revolution, Indigenous survivors of colonial wars and their descendants continued to live a tenuous existence as judicial enslavement was used to subject Indigenous peoples to indentured servitude or slavery after the big colonial wars finished. My work in Connecticut, though, has shown me how long this has continued. It continued at the town level well into the 19th century, longer than previously thought, right? My work is just about the colonial period, and I got to Connecticut and I was like, what? I now have to think about what Americans were up to. Thanks, right? What I'm finding in the town records, it was shocking to me, was how Indigenous people continued to be enslaved or indentured under a new name. Now they were apprentices at a time when this practice was declining rapidly for white Americans. And what you can see here is a document of an apprentice agreement from the 19th century. That's what's on the slide. And I will say this, it is a really good thing for me to be challenged by these research findings. The stuff that I'm finding in Connecticut is expanding the possibilities for my project in ways that I had not thought possible. And it's helping me to rethink several things. The duration of English/American, right? Enslavement of Indigenous peoples. The ways that town governments in particular continued to separate Indigenous families, remove Indigenous children, and extract Indigenous labor on an individual level. Like this becomes such a personal and intimate process. This also further complicates how I am thinking about the ongoing process of racial formation and how Indigenous resistance informed the antebellum abolition movement. And Indigenous participation in abolition gets very little attention. So this has opened a door for me that I didn't know existed. All this is to say that the research at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History has really pushed my research and argumentation in new directions, and I'm most grateful for that. I want to thank you all for listening to me today. I know this is a very difficult topic, so I appreciate your careful attention, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was really full of so much information and very enlightening. Please, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put those in the chat at this time. We'll give everybody a minute. I had a quick question while others are composing. We know that the English had Indigenous allies. Did the English ever record anything about their Indigenous allies' complaints about the treatment of their enemies, other Indigenous enemies?
Oh, yes, they do. I didn't get, because this paper is doing a specific thing, I didn't get to talk about that. But oh my goodness, especially during the Pequot War, there is substantial pushback by the Narragansett, in particular, against what the English are doing to Indigenous captives. Like the Narragansett are consistently outraged by how English colonists were treating the Pequot, the ways that they were sort of hunting them to ground, if you will. So yes, there was absolutely Indigenous pushback. And, I'm flattening out what is obviously really complicated. And one thing that I don't get to talk about in this short of a presentation is the role of Indigenous allies. The English colonists had Indigenous allies during the Pequot War and during King Philip's War, and it substantially muddies some of the binaries I'm trying to draw, right? And in the book project, of course, I get to account for that more, but the Indigenous politics that inform their decisions about how to deal with the English and take captives are really complicated. So yes, Indigenous people did not approve, nor did the captives, right? One of the things I'm working on right now is an article about Pequot women's resistance to being enslaved during the Pequot War, right? Like they didn't stay captives very long, and they fled, they fled to the Narragansett or the Mohegan, they fled back to their Pequot lands and started replanting their towns. So there's Indigenous resistance everywhere in this process.
Thank you. We have a question from Carl Evans. Were there any slave auctions in Connecticut?
Ooh, that I haven't found yet, but I get a sense that, yes, there were. Sorry.
Likely, I mean, I would assume by the port towns, because I know we do know that many Indigenous captives went on to down to the Caribbean, so they could have happened in a port town if they did.
Yeah. I mean, the hotbed was Boston, obviously, but Plymouth had their fair share. Connecticut did. Rhode Island is more complicated because, at one point they make a law where they're like, we're not going to have Indian slavery in Rhode Island. Well, they totally had Indian slavery in Rhode Island. I mean, Roger Williams was asking for, captives for himself. So, yeah, but Rhode Island is a little more tricky. But yeah, like none of the colonies' hands are clean when it comes to this process.
Right. Christine is asking, let's see. Oh, I just lost it. There's a few questions coming in. Where did you find the archive information concerning John Hull, the slave items, and the military also purchasing Native Americans for slavery?
Okay, so the John Hull Ledger is at the New England Historical Genealogical Register, or at that society. That's where the original document is. It has been digitized though, so it's fairly accessible, but that's where I looked at the original in the archive at the New England Genealogical Historical Society.
Let's see. Another question. Can you tell us any more information about an example of a Connecticut town separating Native American families?
Oh crap. I knew somebody was sorry. I knew somebody was going to ask me this, and it's totally in. I have a bazillion photos from when I was there in August, and I can't for the life of me now. I cannot remember the name of the towns. I'm so sorry, but
Now, is
Rats,
some of
I
that
can't.
information, would that be found in an account book or a bill of sale?
Okay, so let me tell you about the town records. They work a little, they're a little different because I looked at town records. So I did my research, my first round of research in August. I looked at town records both at the the group that I'm talking to, where I'm talking about today, and at the Connecticut State Archives. And what you see with town records are usually there's a box, there's a folder with town records. It has all sorts of stuff in it. It has records, talking about land sales, talking about education, talking about property. But in several of those groups of records, what I found weren't account books, they were apprenticeship contracts.
Mhm.
So somebody in the town, one of the selectmen, was responsible for dealing with the poor people in town. And Indigenous people were usually, living on the margins, were um, part of the impoverished group of people in the town. So what I would find in the town records is usually one folder with apprenticeship contracts where Indigenous families had given up their children because they were too poor to support their children. So the children were sent into apprenticeship in English homes. As we move into the late 18th and 19th century, that's usually how it worked. So, Connecticut town selectmen may have felt that they were providing important financial support for children, and in one way they were. But the reality is that they're still separating Indigenous families, right? So, this to me isn't something I expected. And it's still something that I'm very much trying to peel back the layers of meaning. That's sort of a long answer to say, though, that the evidence are in like town record collections, and the apprenticeships of Indigenous people are in separate file folders than the apprenticeships of poor white children and poor families. So they make a racial distinction
Right.
in sort of the record keeping.
I'd be curious to see if, as time goes on, if that also includes other people of color, of African descent, former slaves, if they were going to be presented to be a burden on the town, would they be included in a apprentice program to not for the town not to have to provide for them?
You're asking if that happened to African children too?
Right, right. Or
I
formerly
I
enslaved.
did not find that.
Interesting.
However, by this point, there had been substantial racial intermixing between African and
Right.
Indigenous populations, right? So there certainly were people, multiracial people who fell into these categories.
So, a couple more questions. One guest is doing some research about prominent families that left Massachusetts to come to Connecticut, and found several of these families had Indigenous servants. In your research, did you come across the Ripley family? They were curious if that rings a bell.
I'm sorry, that does not currently ring a bell. That doesn't mean it's not somewhere in my I have like 800 pictures to catalog from my August research trip, so they could be there. I can't recall them off the top of my head. I'm so sorry.
Right. And if this guest knows what town they went to, they can certainly look for town records as
Yes.
well. Another question from Caroline. Were the Connecticut post-revolutionary town records you looked at that included apprentice part of a yes, you did address that
Yeah,
part of
I
the
kind of
relief.
answered that. Yep.
So it didn't
Yep,
become the burden of the town. Let's
absolutely.
see. For those that were apprenticed, are there ways to determine their names? Are there, through a will or a death document, or do you see them anywhere else as time goes on?
Yes. So for those that were apprenticed, um, their names are usually included in the apprentice contracts, right? So they'll have the name of mom and dad or whichever parent or is there. Sometimes they were orphan children. They will have the name usually of the child. In round two of my research, because I have 2 more weeks at the center yet, I plan to do some follow through with the congressional or with the congregational records because I did have luck finding a couple of them in church records, like, to trace through they stayed in the town and, if they married or had children or whatever. So that is like the next steps in Connecticut once I'm done with the town records. And I have a few more of those to sort of explore yet as well.
Wow, this is a huge project.
Oh,
Unbelievable.
yeah.
Very interesting. And I like that, there are still surprises that you don't know where things might lead to. That's really kind of fascinating to see, what direction things could go.
Yeah, it was really, really eye-opening for me because I've done so much archival research. I thought, oh, I've got a pretty good beat on this, and then Connecticut is upsetting my apple cart, and that's good. That's a good thing when
I think that's what
you
we're known
find
for.
that yes, that's a good thing to know that I have work to do and can make some different arguments than what I thought. So I'm excited. I see there's one more question that came up in the chat.
Yeah, one last question. Are you able to tell us anything about the relationship between the English and the Christianized Native people that went to Deer Island after the war?
I can tell you a little bit about that. So as the war wound down, they were taken back off. Those who were still on Deer Island and some of the other Boston Harbor islands um, were relocated like back to Natick and Hessamesett. So the English reconstructed some of the praying towns, but it took. Well, I can't even say this. I can't say this, but I get a sense that the recovery of relationships and good faith between English / now American and Christianized Indigenous people is ongoing. That there was like the removal of the Christianized Native Americans was a substantial moment of harm, um, of generational harm,
Hmm.
and I think that's a moment for ongoing healing and reconciliation. That's how I would respond to that question.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for this presentation. This is so interesting and just,
thank you.
gosh, wealth. We can't wait to have you back researching here. And we'll have to have you
So,
back when you're finished with your book. Do you know when it will be published?
oh my God, no.
No.
I am so I will tell you this. I finished my dissertation in 2020. I started a tenure track job in the fall of 2020 in the midst of COVID. Um, Being a new untenured professor during COVID has been profoundly challenging for me. And I only recently found the space in my brain to figure out what this book needs to be about, what I need to do with my dissertation research. And so it'll probably be probably 2 years, but I would say,
Well, it
but
sounds like it's
yeah,
growing.
it is growing and it has become something I think that will be much better than I had imagined. So that's where I'll stop. But thank you for your attention and great questions. I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you. I just want to mention, Barbara had mentioned that of the 600 Native people that were on Deer Island, only 150 survived. So that in and of itself is quite a story, I'm sure, that needs to be told.
Oh
For
yeah.
sure.
And I threw my email in the chat if anyone
Oh,
has
thank
further
you.
questions.
Thank you so much. And I just want to, as I always do, share some upcoming programs that we have at uh, the museum. We have uh, ties to the Caribbean and ancient burying ground, and Dr. Hermes will do a talk on the 18th that is for a fee. And then we have a date night, True Crime at the Museum. Our new exhibition, the Connecticut Bookshelf, has a section on true crime. So we're kind of tapping into that to look at what forgeries and murder and arson records we have in our collection, and then a mystery home. So you can discover a little bit about your historic home. We will have a presentation and also time for guests to do research or begin their research with the help of our research center staff to help you get started on that research. So those are just a few of the upcoming programs. As always, you can check out our event page at connecticutmuseum.org. And once again, thank you so much, Joanne, for an amazing presentation today. And I will be sending it to you and to all of our guests today, the recording when that is on our YouTube page. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.